My name is Jonathan Zimmerman. I'm a professor of education and history at New York University. And the last book that I published was a history of sex education around the world. This book was, like all acts of history, in some ways a personal book because my mother actually was a family planning and sex education expert. And one of the things that she taught me as I was growing up was that the United States was behind other countries, especially those in Europe, on the subject of sex education, that Europeans were more direct, more explicit, more honest about the subject. And what I discovered in the course of doing this book is that actually the United States was the pioneer of sex education around the world. Rather than being the laggard, it started it, in part because the United States was a pioneer of mass higher education. But then the other thing that was more interesting I discovered was instead of Europe being ahead and us behind or vice versa, that actually sex ed, when it took root in Europe, had a very different set of goals. The idea of ahead and behind any race implies a shared goal, a shared finish line. And what I discovered in the course of researching this book is that actually the goals were quite different. In the United States, sex education began, and I would say still exists, in order to prevent certain negative collective outcomes, namely teen pregnancy and STDs. It began during venereal disease outbreaks in this country 100 years ago, and the goal was to try to promote sexual continence so that the collective, indeed the nation, sometimes the race, would remain healthy. Well, in Europe, the goals were quite different, especially in Sweden, which was the first country to require sex education. There, the goal was much more individuated. The idea wasn't necessarily to ward off negative collective consequences. It was to help each individual develop and determine a sexual life, including sexual pleasure. And that's a very different kind of goal. And in some ways, I discovered this comparison, this contrast runs contrast to many other stories that we tell comparing the United States and Europe, wherein the United States is all about the individual and the individual's path and the individual's rights. And Europe is about the collectivity. In fact, with sex education, I discovered it was precisely the opposite. Sex ed here was about the collectivity, again, specifically protecting the health of the collectivity. And in Europe, especially Scandinavia, much more oriented towards the individual.